The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The dim glow of a street lamp flickered above the empty sidewalk, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere, in the distance, a dog barked, but the sound was swallowed by the stillness. It was the kind of night where nothing was supposed to happen. But for Emily, a young, heavily pregnant woman walking home from the corner store, the night was about to take a turn she would never forget. She had just picked up a few groceries, milk, bread, and a small bag of candy she'd been craving for days. Her hands were full, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the baby, about the nursery they still needed to finish, about the way her husband Daniel had been working late every night this week. He'd been distant lately, quieter than usual, but she chalked it up to stress. After all, they were about to become parents for the first time. Life was changing, and change was never easy. But as she turned the corner onto her street, Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just someone else out late, maybe a neighbor heading home. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, and soon she could hear muffled voices, low, rough, and unmistakably menacing. Her heart began to race, her grip tightening on the grocery bag. She quickened her pace, but so did they. And then, before she could react, they were in front of her. 3 men, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. "Well, what do we have here?" one of them sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to speak, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. The men circled her like predators, their laughter cutting through the night like a knife. One of them reached out, grabbing her arm with a grip so tight it made her wince. "You shouldn't be out here all alone, sweetheart," another said, his tone laced with menace. "Bad things happen to pretty girls like you." Emily's mind raced. She thought about screaming, about running, but she knew she couldn't. Not in her condition. Not with the baby. She was trapped, and the men knew it. They taunted her, their words growing crueler with each passing second. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Emily wasn't as defenseless as she seemed. Because while she was just a pregnant woman trying to get home, her husband Daniel was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. Daniel wasn't just a man who worked late. He wasn't just a soon-to-be father or a quiet, reserved husband. He was a killer. Not the kind who loses his temper and lashes out in a moment of rage, but the kind who's trained, methodical, and utterly ruthless. His past was a shadowy maze of secrets, a life he'd tried to leave behind when he met Emily. But some things you can't outrun, and some skills you can't forget. And as Emily stood there trembling under the weight of the men's threats, Daniel was already on his way. He'd seen her leave the house, seen her take longer than usual, and something in his gut had told him to follow. The men didn't notice him at first. They were too focused on Emily, too caught up in their own cruelty to see the figure approaching from the shadows. But when they finally did, it was too late. Daniel moved like a ghost, silent and swift, his eyes cold and unflinching. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look on his face was enough to make the men hesitate, their bravado faltering for the first time. But hesitation wouldn't save them. Not from what was coming. And as Emily watched, her heart pounding in her chest, she realized something she'd never fully understood before. The man she loved, the father of her child, was a stranger in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. And tonight, that stranger was about to show the world just how far he would go to protect what was his. But what happened next? Did Daniel unleash the fury he'd kept buried for so long? Or would the men's recklessness lead to a confrontation no one could walk away from? The answers were coming, but not yet. Because in the darkness of that quiet street, the night was far from over. And for Emily, for Daniel, and for the men who'd made the mistake of crossing them, nothing would ever be the same again. The air grew heavier as Daniel stepped into the circle of light cast by the flickering street lamp. His presence was like a storm rolling in, quiet but charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. She had never seen him like this before. The man she knew was gentle, patient, the kind of person who would spend hours assembling a crib or reading parenting books late into the night. But this version of Daniel was different. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp and calculating, and his movements were deliberate, almost predatory. It was as if a switch had been flipped, revealing a side of him she didn't recognize. The men, for their part, seemed to sense the shift too. The one holding Emily's arm loosened his grip slightly, his bravado wavering. "Back off, man," he barked, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments earlier. "This doesn't concern you." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was more unnerving than any words could have been. He took another step, forward. His gaze locked on the man who had dared to touch his wife. The other two thugs exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier swagger replaced by a growing sense of unease. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She wanted to call out to Daniel, to tell him to be careful, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating like the calm before a storm, and then without warning one of the men lunged at Daniel, a knife glinting in his hand. Emily's breath hitched, but Daniel moved faster than she could have imagined. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the man, twisting his wrist until the knife clattered to the ground. The thug cried out in pain, stumbling backward, but Daniel didn't stop. He was a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless, and the men were quickly realizing they had made a terrible mistake. But even as the confrontation unfolded, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Who were these men and why had they targeted her? And more importantly, who was Daniel really? She thought she knew him, but now she wasn't so sure. The man standing in front of her, the man who moved with the precision of a soldier and the cold detachment of a predator, was a stranger. And yet he was also the man she loved, the father of her child. The contradiction was almost too much to process. As the fight continued, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship. She remembered how they'd met. A chance encounter at a coffee shop, of all places. Daniel had been sitting alone reading a book, and she had been struck by how calm and composed he seemed. He had a quiet confidence about him, a steadiness that drew her in. They'd started talking, and before she knew it, they were spending every spare moment together. He was kind, thoughtful, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel at ease. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when she caught a glimpse of something darker beneath the surface. A flicker of pain in his eyes, a hesitation in his voice when she asked about his past. He never talked about it, and she never pushed. Everyone had secrets, after all. But now, as she watched him take down the men who had threatened her, she couldn't help but wonder what those secrets were. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. The three men were on the ground, groaning in pain, and Daniel stood over them, his chest rising and falling with the effort of keeping his emotions in check. He turned to Emily, his expression softening as he took in the fear and confusion in her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now, almost tender. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Her hands were trembling and her heart was still pounding in her chest, but she was alive. That was what mattered. Daniel reached out to her, his touch careful and reassuring, but Emily couldn't help but flinch. It wasn't that she was afraid of him. She knew he would never hurt her, but she was afraid of what this moment meant. The life they had built together, the future they had planned, felt like it was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't quite understand. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. But then he shook his head, his jaw tightening once more. "Not here," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to get you home." As they walked away from the scene, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the men following them, but the street was empty. Still, the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow she couldn't quite escape. And as they reached their house, Daniel's hand resting protectively on the small of her back, she knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever secrets Daniel was hiding, They were about to come to light, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same. But for now, there were no answers, only questions. Who were those men, and why had they targeted her? What was Daniel's past, and how had it shaped him into the man he was today? And most importantly, what would happen when the truth finally came out? The tension hung in the air, unresolved and unrelenting as Emily and Daniel stepped inside their home. The door closed behind them, but the night was far from over. And somewhere, in the shadows, something or someone was waiting. The house felt different that night. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the way the moonlight filtered through the curtains. It all seemed sharper, more pronounced, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Daniel moved through the room with a quiet urgency. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and drew the blinds, his movements precise and deliberate. Every now and then he would glance at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? Fear? She wasn't sure. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "We need to talk." He stopped mid-step, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't turn around. For a moment she thought he might ignore her, might pretend everything was fine and carry on as if nothing had happened. But then he sighed, a deep, weary sound, and turned to face her. "I know," he said quietly. "But not here. Not yet." Emily frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Not here? Daniel, I was just attacked by 3 men on our street. I think I deserve to know what's going on." He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window before returning to her. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "You do, but it's not safe here. We need to leave." Emily's eyes widened. "Leave? What are you talking about? This is our home." Daniel shook his head, his expression grim. "It's not safe anymore. Those men tonight, they weren't random. They were looking for me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Looking for you? Why? What did you do?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "It's not that simple, Emily. There are things about my past, things I thought I could leave behind, but I was wrong." He took a step toward her, his voice softening. "I never wanted you to be dragged into this. I thought if I kept it buried, if I stayed quiet, we could have a normal life, but I was wrong." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but all she could feel was a deep, aching sadness. The man standing in front of her was the same man she had fallen in love with, the same man who had held her hand through every ultrasound and whispered promises of a future together, and yet he was also someone she didn't know at all. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound, his body tense and ready. Emily's heart pounded as she watched him, her fear growing with each passing second. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who is that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to stay where she was and moved toward the door, his steps silent and cautious. He peered through the peephole, his expression unreadable, and then let out a breath she didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's okay," he said, though his tone didn't exactly inspire confidence. "It's just an old friend." He opened the door to reveal a man Emily had never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen its share of battles. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a practiced ease, and when they landed on Emily, she felt a shiver of unease. "This is Marcus," Daniel said, his voice tight. "He's here to help." Marcus nodded but didn't offer a smile. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be here soon." Emily's stomach churned. "Who will be here soon? What's going on?" Daniel turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "I'll explain everything, I promise. But right now, we need to go." He reached for her hand. But she pulled away, her fear and confusion boiling over. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening. I deserve to know the truth, Daniel. All of it." For a moment it looked like he might argue. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," he said quietly. "You do." He glanced at Marcus, who gave a curt nod and stepped outside to keep watch. Daniel turned back to Emily, his expression pained. "Before I met you, I wasn't the person you think I am. I did things I'm not proud of. I worked for people who, let's just say, they don't take kindly to being crossed. I thought I was out, that I could start over. But tonight proved that's not the case. Those men weren't random. They were sent to send a message. And if they found me, it's only a matter of time before others do too." Emily felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand more answers, but all she could do was sit there, staring at him in stunned silence. The man she loved, the father of her child, had a past she couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now that past was threatening to destroy everything they had built together. Before she could respond, Marcus reappeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "We need to go. Now." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. He reached for Emily, again, and this time she didn't pull away. She was too numb, too overwhelmed to resist. As they stepped out into the night, the weight of Daniel's secrets pressing down on her, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. And somewhere in the shadows, the danger was closer than ever.